I'd like to introduce tonight someone that I was thinking that we'd met before, and Maulian Dana informed me that indeed she was involved in some presentations to the Wiscasset school board when they were taking up the matter of whether to do away with having a mascot that was very disrespectful of the tribes and the native indigenous people. So it's been a long time trying to make changes in this state, and it's great to see some things happen. And Maulian will fill us in for a bit, and then we'll go into a Q&A. She's also joined by Toby McGrath. I should say Maulian Dana is Penobscot Nation Tribal Ambassador and President of the Wabanaki Alliance. And Toby McGrath is a political and government relations consultant who works with the Wabanaki Alliance. So Maulian, if you'd unmute yourself and take it away. Thank you.
Great, thank you, and nice to see you again. I did a lot of those guest visits to schools when I was in high school, and it was terrifying work, but it was great to see the results and see those mascots change and to really move people's hearts and minds. So thank you for your vote back then, and great to see you tonight. Thanks so much for having Toby and I on. I'm really excited to talk about the efforts in the legislature over the past couple of years when it comes to tribal sovereignty. I'm kind of a child of tribal politics. My dad served as a tribal chief for 2 terms in 2000 and 2004. My great aunt Donna Loring was our tribal representative around that time and had a very long career and was most recently the tribal liaison to Governor Mills. So this is a subject I've been kind of steeped in for a long time, and it's an honor every day that I get to work in such an exciting and transformative time in tribal state relations. So tonight I want to talk about the most recent efforts to amend the 1980 Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act. And this was a piece of law that was passed to settle claims to land. And these are very valid claims to land that the tribes had because it was discovered by the Passamaquoddy people first that about 2/3 of the state of Maine was illegally taken from the tribes because those treaties had never been ratified through the federal government. So what ensued was kind of a time of chaos and negotiations, and it produced this document and this set of parameters around settling these claims to land. It took it a step further and also set up a lot of jurisdictional framework that has been used to completely gut and undermine tribal sovereignty in these past 40 years. There's also language in the act that blocks the tribes in Maine, even though we are federally recognized tribes, from having access to federal legislation that would benefit our communities and that we should be entitled to as tribes. So since 1980, 151 federal laws have passed that the tribes in Maine have not had access to because of this restrictive language in the Settlement Act. And that's caused a lot of hardships in our communities. And the bottom line is the tribes in 1980, by agreeing to this act, never agreed to give away our status as sovereign tribal nations. So this Settlement Act has been studied, and recommendations have been made to amend it a few different times. And it's really been the cause of a lot of the tension and conflict and confusion between the tribes and the state. Essentially, the act can be interpreted in a way where the tribes are a ward of the state of Maine, and it sets up this really, hierarchy that the tribes never agreed to. And, we're always kind of constantly trying to assert ourselves as tribal sovereign nations, but the Settlement Act has loomed over a lot of that. And, the state has certainly consistently interpreted the act to keep up this relationship of the tribes being a ward of the state. So in 2019, the state convened a task force with tribal leaders and lawmakers who were voting members, and then representatives from the Attorney General's office and the governor's office who were non-voting members. And this task force met, I believe, 7 or 8 times and studied the act. The tribal attorneys did some really great education around federal Indian law and why that should apply to the tribes in Maine, and the benefits for not just the tribes, but for everyone in the state if we had access to these federal acts, if we had increased jurisdictional powers on tribal land. There is education around what tribal lands are and where they are. And the result of these meetings was this list of 22 recommendations. Those recommendations were put into a very large bill, and that was LD 2094 in the 129th legislature. We were able to get that bill voted out of the Judiciary Committee, but the pandemic stopped our work. We didn't come back into a special session, so we had to start fresh in the 130th legislature. So the bill as it stands right now is LD 1626. It's sponsored by Representative Rachel Talbot Ross. And it is those task force recommendations that were nearly unanimously voted on, and that was a bipartisan task force. It's all of them except for one recommendation that deals with the Violence Against Women Act. I spoke about how those federal laws haven't been able to be applicable to Maine tribes. So we passed a separate piece of legislation in the 129th legislature that extended the provisions of the Federal Violence Against Women Act to the tribes in Maine with tribal courts. So that's Penobscot and Passamaquoddy. So that was a recommendation of the task force, but we accomplished it with a separate bill. So thankfully we can check that off the list. We've also removed the gaming provision. So the task force voted to include tribal gaming as regulated by the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. And we removed that recommendation and made it its own piece of legislation, basically as a strategy. Gaming is really its own thing in Maine, especially when it comes to the tribes, I think. So that bill is still active in the process. That's going through the Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee. They actually had a work session today where they voted to table it till next week, but I think it's looking pretty favorable, and we're having a lot of good discussion around that in committee. Anyway, the LD 1626, sponsored by Representative Rachel Talbot Ross, will be carried over into the next year of this session. So we'll be coming back in January. And essentially the reasoning for that is it came out of the revisor's office very late. There is a lot to the bill. There was concern that the Attorney General's office and the tribal attorneys would need some time, along with the Judiciary Committee in their committee work, to really give this bill the attention that it needs and tighten up language and all of that. So the decision was made to push it back a little bit, and now the charge for Wabanaki Alliance and tribal leaders is keeping up the energy and momentum that we've been able to generate around this bill. We have, I think, around 40 organizations that have signed on to support us. We've had different county committees like yourselves pass in resolutions supporting this bill. So we're at the point where it's frustrating to kind of keep moving forward and keep stepping back. But I think each time we move forward, we get a little bit further. And as I've alluded to, I've been around this stuff for a very long time. And I know that this law has been like the lay of the land for tribal issues since 1980. And it's been really hard to get people across those barriers of understanding that there is federal Indian law and that the tribes in Maine should have parity with other tribes, even though we have this settlement act. So essentially what we've been really pushing around this is that this is all about fairness. It's all about equity. It's about a restoration of rights, a restoration of sovereignty. It's nothing to be afraid of or nervous about. I think when we really get down to it and talk about tribal sovereignty, it not only benefits the tribe to, you know, have all the rights of other tribes in the country, it really benefits Maine. You know, talking about public health, economic development, just about every area you can think of, the environment. If the tribes are doing well, the state will do well. And I think that's something we've been pretty successful with this go around in reaching out to our allies, neighbors, and friends about how supporting tribal sovereignty can really uplift so many different people in Maine. And Toby can chime in if I missed anything. Thank you for the links, Kelli. You're muted, Toby. You're still muted.
I was like pinned.
There you go.
I don't know why it's so muted. There we go. No, I think you hit all of it perfectly, as usual. You know, I think ultimately, like you said, we take progress moving forward, and always reminds us of MLK's the arc of the moral justice is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think that's where we are. So, I mean, you covered all of it. So I think more of it is along the lines of folks that may have questions about this. I will add one other thing. I do think next week, when we take a vote in the Veteran VLA committee, we are at least a majority vote already, if not picking up 2 Republicans in support of the legislation. So we're potentially already at 10 votes for tribal sovereignty gaming.
So questions and answers. If anyone has a question you'd like to ask, please raise your, Marilyn Byoff. Unmute.
Thank you for the presentation. That's very interesting. I understand, and I've read a little bit about the opposition to the gaming portion of the legislation, but where does the opposition, what is the opposition to expanding tribal rights to recognize federal law?
Well, Governor Mills submitted opposition testimony to this bill, and she has some issues with the size and scope of the bill. And I believe there's just some attitudes in Maine that are very entrenched around when the tribes are looking to have rights restored. It feels like we're asking for the state to give power away. So what we're trying to do is to reframe that as, you know, us restoring our sovereignty doesn't take away from anybody else, and it doesn't take away from the control or the power of the state. And I think some of the other opposition we heard was from some municipalities that are nervous about the land into trust process. And I believe that there's enough in the bill and enough in that very lengthy process with the federal government to alleviate those local concerns. And then that's something we're talking about with those local towns. But the opposition thus far at the hearing, the main opposition was from the governor's office.
And I'll just add to this that, you know, even though we tried to pull back the reins because the public hearing, we're going to have a much lengthier conversation next year. Over 200 folks supported and submitted testimony. And the opposition, to be quite frank, the other, you know, we get people saying, if the tribes are able to oversee the rivers, they may make them too clean. And then we have another side that says, they may make them too dirty. So like they're kind of all over the place. And that's it's basically the mills, and I don't mean, well, government mills being one of them, but also the mill industry and the forest products industry. And if you look at the history of what occurred, the folks that are in opposition today were staffers for Senator Cohen in 1980, who, back in 1980, the forest products industry was vitally opposed to the Selman Act. Then all of a sudden they changed their tune. And when the Selman Act was done, and what happened? Basically, they were able to sell a lot of their lands to the tribes that had been raped and pillaged already. Well, fast forward 40 years later, it's the lobbyist for the forest products industry who was the staffer for Senator Cohen, who was part of the opposition with Governor Mills. But there's like 8 people that were opposed out of 220.
Thank you.
To get to my own unmute. Other questions? John Iltis, you were not muted. Were you looking to ask a question?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. Anyone else who would like to ask any questions? Raise your hand or unmute. Kelly?
Yeah, Maulian and Toby, I wonder, Maulian mentioned, I'm sorry, Ambassador Dana mentioned that there are a coalition of about 40 groups that are working with the tribes to help advance this. And we're going to be looking at things we can do between now and next January when the bill comes back up. What suggestions do you have for people with the Lincoln County Democrats, things that we could be doing to not only support legislators that we have who do support this legislation, but also maybe we do have a couple of people who I'm not entirely sure where they stand on it, Representatives Lemelin and Hanley. What can we do to help move the needle on that?
Yeah, so WabanakiAlliance.com, which I think you've already shared. If you get on our email list, we'll kind of have, we'll have like nudges and check-ins around this as we go through this summer and fall. And also, Toby mentioned the huge amount of testimony we got in support. We're looking to have a lot of that turned into letters to the editor and op-eds. So if you review that testimony and feel like you might like to get active yourself, there's a lot of great material in there to pull from. And I think absolutely speaking to any lawmaker about these really are issues that aren't always party line issues. So you never really know where people stand. What we hear sometimes is people say they've never been approached about it. They don't know much about it. So I think there's a lot of openings in the legislature where we can start inserting some knowledge, and WabanakiAlliance.com has a lot of those talking points. And anybody here could reach out to myself or Toby or other members of the Alliance and people working on this.
I have a question. What would you say are the top 3 or 4 advantages of being a sovereign nation?
That's a great question. I think, the environment, the people, the health of our communities, the access to federal resources and support, that might be more than 3 or 4. But I think as a young person, I remember seeing a lot of losses in court, in our communities. It just seemed like we were constantly fighting and losing. So I formed this perception that it didn't feel very sovereign to have to give things away all the time and lose all the time, but it also felt sovereign to protect things that are sacred. So I think that our communities define sovereignty as protecting those things that are woven into our identity, and that's our culture, the land, the water, and our people. So when you have those things in sync, and when you have the ability to really protect them and nurture them, that's the magic of having those rights and having that sovereignty. So it's more of, a concept, I think. The tribes don't think of ownership like a lot of other cultures do. We don't think we own the lands or waters. We think we're stewards and we protect them. So I think having the ability to really fulfill those cultural values is what sovereignty is.
And this is just over the reservation land at Indiana, wherever you have land. It's not land that you used to own. It's reservation land that you're talking about.
That's a great point. So all of the changes in jurisdictional powers in this bill are over tribal lands. And we have a map that shows where those lands are. And it's kind of shocking when you see the map, how little land this would affect in Maine. So yes, you're exactly right. We have reservation land and trust land, which is where a lot of these things would be applicable to. We also have fee land where a lot of them wouldn't be applicable to.
Right. Yeah, because I've done a lot of study about sovereignty issues with tribes out west, and I you know, the problem is even if you're you know, a tribe out in the Dakotas and you have your reservation land, companies are still able to come in and do things like pipelines. So my question is, I don't really understand exactly how much sovereignty you actually have as a federally recognized sovereign nation, if so many bad things can actually happen to your land.
That's a really great thing to point out. There's a whole lot of injustice, and just imagine the Maine tribes where we don't even have the same rights as those tribes out there that are facing that injustice. So we're even further behind in Maine.
Yeah. So does that have to do with like the Bureau of the Department of and the Bureau of Land, that they're able to make these deals with companies and the native tribes don't have any say because the agents that work for the Bureau are appointed by senators from that state and they may have vested interests? I mean, it just seems so incredible to me that this goes on, within a sovereign nation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one bright point under the Biden administration is that we now have Deb Haaland as Secretary of the Interior, which is a huge step for representation. And so I think there's places to feel hope, but there's certainly a whole history of oppression, and it's ingrained deeply in the systems.
Yeah, because when you use the phrase wards of the state, I mean, even if being a non-sovereign nation, you're a ward of the state, but those people who have their land, the Navajos and they're wards of the state too, because they don't really have complete power over their resources. So, it's a terrible situation. I'm certainly hope that Deb Haaland can change things for finally.
Well, and for that to apply in Maine, we still need to pass this legislation, right? Because you're not benefiting from those federal laws.
Right.
I have a question.
I have a question too.
So, I was about to ask for more. Is that Jason?
Yeah, that's Jason.
Please go ahead, Jason.
Maulian, I'll try to be quick. I think it would be fair to say, I didn't live here at the time, but it sounds like when Governor Mills was Attorney General, she wasn't super popular with the tribal communities. I don't think that she was considered particularly empathetic. Do you think it doesn't sound like, I mean, maybe she's changed her tune a little bit. Do you think she has? Do you think her attitudes maybe have transferred to the new Attorney General? Do you think that she might veto this legislation in May if it gets through the House and the Senate? Do you think it's possible that she's the final hurdle? I mean, are you optimistic that this could actually happen with her as governor?
All of the above. It's true that as Attorney General, she was involved in litigation against the tribes. She expressed some views that showed a real lack of understanding about sovereignty and a real need to kind of double down on state control and authority. As governor, she did tell myself and other tribal leaders that she would wear a different hat than AG and she would approach the role in a different way. And I think in some instances, she's absolutely done that. And she's done some good things. And she has put in an effort in some areas. On this bill, there's a long way to go. And I do think that part of our work is anticipating a possible veto and how to best mitigate that.
Does any of this lead up to the tribes having actual votes as their seats? They have seats in the House of Representatives, but not in the Senate. Is that correct?
Sure,
Right.
yes. Yep.
Okay, but they don't have votes. They have a seat, but they don't get to vote. Is that why some tribal members have chosen not to participate, because they don't actually have a vote? Is that as a form of protest? to that
Not
situation?
exactly sure. When the seats were established, the tribes were already in districts that are represented by state reps and senators. So it would have been double representation unless we wanted to make our own tribal districts. And then a lot of people in the tribes don't want a vote because that would put us kind of in the same level as a municipality. So they feel like there should be, a way to differentiate. Now, the Penobscot Nation doesn't have a representative right now. We removed them in 2015, and that's actually my role is filling that space for representatives. So I don't sit in the chamber, but I'm kind of tasked with keeping track of legislation and testifying and reporting to council and all of that. So kind of, filling that without being there. The Passamaquoddy did reseat their representative, and that's Representative Rena Newell. And she can submit legislation, sit in committee, vote in committee, but not vote in the chamber. So that's something that I think each community will need to revisit as we go to see if that's the best, if the route we're taking is the best for the time being. And I know I'm a little bit biased, but I feel like the ambassador position has worked fairly well. It's kind of, walking that talk of being a sovereign because it's coming from a government to government and not from a municipality to a state government. But each tribe needs to kind of figure out what's working the best for them.
Can I just add three things?
Yeah.
Just the idea of why we're carrying the bill over is, the governor's office has met with us on Settlement Act issues 7 times over 700 days now. We're trying to make sure, and what we heard from the governor was or her staff, willing to work on 2 out of the 22 recommendations. When we went back to the chiefs with that, they said, I know we only have about a month left. We want to get this right, but we are not going to just work on 2 of 22 recommendations from the task force. We want to work on all of them. And so that's why we are committed to working with the governor and the AG's office over this time span, the summer and fall, to give them one last chance to come to the table and really work on these issues with us in good faith. And so that's kind of where I think we are with the administration. I'm hopeful. I think they're more at the table now than I believe, which isn't saying much to where they were before. And then also your Jason, your question about having representatives. It's a constitutional issue because what happened, it's a federal constitutional issue when it comes down to having elected officials in Congress, state houses, things like that. You can't, it's geographically based, and you can't be like, we're going to have a representative for the Italians and the Irish and those types of things. So that's the other point that I wanted to make from a systematic standpoint.
Right.
Onto it, that it's a constitutional issue that you can't, because we've looked at this. And when I was in the legislature and worked up there, we looked at trying to provide tribal, but there's a constitutional issue of allocating it that way for a group of people. So.
Seems like you could also see it that if you did participate in that system, you would be saying that you think it's a valid system. You kind of boxed in a little bit, as a sovereign nation.
We just have to change the Maine Constitution with a 2/3 vote in the House and then send it out to voters.
Well, good luck. Thank you. That's good luck.
Thank you.
Right. So, Sue Rockwood.
Thanks. And so we're 2 people in the screen. I'm going to go first, but we're Quakers, and we've been informed by Jim Matlack, who's a member of our local meeting. He's on the Friends Committee for Maine Public Policy. And he's been communicating and getting us to write letters and do that kind of thing. But as I was talking, as we've been talking to him, there's not only the positive sides of getting recognized in sovereignty, there's the negative sides, which a lot of people don't know about, I think, of not having that sovereignty. And so I'm wondering if Ambassador Dana could point out a couple of areas which would change and make tribal life better if they get sovereignty.
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest things is the language around the federal legislation that this act would fix this bill. And, that's everything from FEMA funding to different, pretty much any law that passes in the federal arena that should benefit tribes can't benefit Maine tribes. And so, thinking about public health, economic development, I think that the lives of our tribal members would be greatly improved if we had more resources, had more opportunities, and had access to those acts. I also think from an environmental standpoint, if we could clear up a lot of this litigation around the Settlement Act with the state of Maine, we could see much cleaner water. We could, possibly someday actually practice sustenance fishing. We could have the Penobscot Nation, recognized as our ancestral territory instead of just the islands. So I think like the health and the economic development for people and the environment are kind of, areas that jump out at me.
Thank you. And I'm gonna cheat and let Bruce in because he's been being patient.
I also wanted to say one way to approach Governor Mills on this. I've been attending all the sessions of the Maine Climate Council, is the close connection between the Wabanaki people, the Native peoples, and their commitment to the restoring the land and preserving the land and thinking in terms of 7 generations, and the governor's strong commitment to climate change and dealing with it in the next 10 years. I don't think we can reconcile the governor's climate position without adopting sovereignty for the Wabanaki. I just purchased a book. I'll just wave it at you, but it's All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. That includes a number of useful essays. I'll share it with you as a link, but I'm very much committed to addressing climate change. And I think that one way to win the governor over on this would be to bring her to the table of the way in which Native peoples can support the land and preserve it. And I'm certainly going to work on that on my job here now on the Democratic platform. So.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm actually the sole tribal member sitting on the Climate Council, and the governor appointed me to it. So there is that link for sure. And she does have some great views around the climate. And I think that's something that's a great idea strategically. I also am a co-chair of the subcommittee on equity for the Climate Council. And we will be presenting our recommendations from an equity standpoint to the full Climate Council in December. We're working away at a different topic each month right now. And I do think there's a lot of opportunity there to tie in tribal sovereignty. Great idea.
So I just want to ask a quick question. One of the things that's come through lately with money to help communities, counties, the state is the American Rescue Plan. And I know that in some of that federal law, there's carve outs to tribes as well. Are you unable to receive any of those funds because of the Maine Land Claim Settlement Act?
We have been able to negotiate our own funding from the federal government of all the relief acts. And I think that that's helped us so much. The whole pandemic, we've been really trying to be, as sovereign as possible. We've put checkpoints in front of our communities to try to stop the spread. We closed our buildings and schools before other communities. And, I think pandemics and germs and infections are very triggering for our people because of how many of our ancestors died from diseases they weren't immune to. So, we've been taking a very hard stance with all of that, and being able to bring in our own relief funds has certainly lifted a burden from the state. And that's a very great point to make when thinking about all of this. It's like, look what we were able to do negotiating as sovereign nations directly with the federal government. We didn't have to go through the state and tie up state resources and state funds.
Can I just add a few things to that? One, the congressional delegation had to put it in the language. This includes the Maine tribes when they did that, to make sure that they could apply specifically. I'll also say that I know the Penobscots, I remember this very vividly actually, because COVID was, you heard about it, it was coming, people were having angst around it. And I remember we were having a meeting actually last February with around the legislation. And it was Vice Chief Dana from the Passamaquoddies said, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to come back next week because we are shutting things down because of COVID. And that's what we're gonna do. That was 3 weeks or 4 weeks before the state did anything. And so my point being is they managed this well. I know the Penobscot Nation, talking to Chief Francis, their outcomes and what they did their first responders included teachers out of the gate to get vaccinated. They looked at the whole thing. They looked at it holistically, and their outcomes were really well thought out and done correctly. So I think the big thing about it is, and to be honest with you, we can talk about certain things, but we always had from the administration, what can we do in COVID? What you can do is get out of the way and let us just get the federal funds and implement for our people what we think. I mean, Ambassador, is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for adding that in. I got too excited.
Well, and I'm awfully glad that because of how it was written at the federal level, you were able to take advantage of it. But doesn't this make a demonstration case for what being eligible instead of being disqualified for various kinds of federal funds would be doing?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we've been able to help our business owners, tribal business owners who, took a hit during the pandemic. We've been able to do payouts to them. We've been able to support a lot of our programs, give hazard pay to our workers. We've, got our vaccines directly from the federal government. It's definitely a strong case for increased sovereignty.
And Chris, can I just add one other thing? It's not just that the tribes would benefit, rural Maine would benefit because that's where they're located. So for instance, the Maliseets received a federal grant to pave roads to their property. And what they were able to do is extend those roads within the municipality of Holton, which helped them. They also had funding to get a new, I believe it was police car. So they donated their police car to Holton and got the new police car. So, but because they don't have access to all the federal funds and benefits, it's not just that the tribes lose out, it's that the surrounding communities do as well, because they don't get the roads and bridges and educational and healthcare money that comes into those areas. And I think that's having the state have a thumb on top of the tribes has really harmed economic development as well in many instances.
So thank you. And there's a couple of other things that I wonder if you would touch upon. One is, I recall a conversation with a chief who informed me when we were considering the legislature some things, and that because they do not own the lands, because they are held in trust, the tribes do not have any collateral for borrowing to build a community center or for vocational training or any other things that would be beneficial to the community as a whole. Don't have the same mechanisms to collateralize borrowing that people in other communities do. Would what you're working to pass in this law be able to move the bar on that as well? On the 22 different issues in the recommendations?
I would think so. Toby can chime in. I would think so. I know that it will, lift some restrictions around the land and trust process, and then the increased tribal jurisdiction would be on those trust lands. But yeah, that's a great question that I'll have to think more about.
Well, but I also think there's other elements of federal law that that would benefit the areas where they are. So for instance, I mean, actually, Ambassador, it's similar. The idea of what Penobscot's been trying to do with wind.
Right.
When you get those investors to come in, because of the triple regulation, the investors say, no, thank you, we're out of here. So I think that like when you also can peel off some of the invest. So here, what I'm talking about is the Penobscot Nation was trying to do a wind project, and they can't financially do it themselves, but they can attract dollars to their lands based on tax benefits. But then what happened was these companies are used to like, okay, we can deal with the federal Indian law and tribal laws, but then there's the state in between there. And they're like, forget it, we're done. We're not getting involved in any of this. So I understand your question, Chris, but I think there's also some nuances there that peeling off some of the regulations of the state would allow investors and the investments, they still have to maintain tribal majority on these investments on tribal lands. It's not like they would be handing them over. But so from that standpoint, we are losing investment in these areas on tribal lands because of the triple regulation. And because these investors are used to going to 49 other states and being like, this is how this works. We'll invest. Then they got here. So it's not exactly answering your question, but I just wanted to highlight that that's one of the challenges that we stand here with having the state dictate so much on tribal lands.
Jason, were you looking to ask a question? You're muted.
Yeah, you sort of answered my question. When you said 49 other states, I was going to ask, is this unique to Maine, this situation where the states in between the tribes and the federal government? I'm from northern Michigan, where the local tribe was the first thing that happened when Bill Clinton was elected, is he recognized them after they had tried for many times. Then the floodgates opened for them. And I didn't know if Maine, that was Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians. I didn't know if Maine was the only state that was essentially blocking those benefits, until he just said, so 49 other states, this situation isn't happening. This is unique to Maine, is my question.
Yeah, that's correct.
Very interesting.
I just want to say this about this. There are other states that have similar settlement acts with their state, but none are as restrictive as Maine's. We're just asking, the tribes are just asking to be on the same equal footing as 570 other tribes. The closest place that we could get that have states' thumbs on top of the tribal nations, and it's not even close. So like, this is not like anything, but if we wanted to say there's something close, would be Texas and South Carolina. It would be Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham. So that's where we are. We're worse. We're below that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And then I guess the last thing I wanted to inquire about is, while you're working on changes, at the state level, it seems like there's an awful lot more that needs to be accomplished by all of us in changing what the attitude of the general public is, the lack of awareness of what the culture and philosophies of Indigenous people really are, when they're, in your opening statement, talking about some people are saying that they're going to dirty the water, and some people are saying that they're going to make it too clean. And in none of that was there a worry about what all of the non-Indigenous people are doing already or would do or could do to those waters. It's a us versus them. It's the Indigenous they. So how do we tackle that? What are some things that the Alliance is trying to do, and how can we help with that part? Because I think you need a lot of voices.
I think we're off to a really great start around all of that. And, you know, I've been working on kind of activism around representation and stereotypes and all that for a very, very long time now. And in my discussions and work around Maine, when it comes to mascots and Indigenous Peoples Day, is that a lot of Mainers don't even know there's still tribes. They couldn't tell you where the tribes are, or, you know, there's a lot of people are stuck in this idea of what Indians are and what they do, and a lot of times that's very wrong and inaccurate. So I think it's great we did away with those mascots and we have these issues in the public eye, because people can see, you know, we're living, breathing, ever evolving people contributing to society. We're your neighbors, and we have a lot of the same hopes and goals and worries about our communities and our people. So I find that the best ways to affect change is to really connect with people on that shared humanity. That's why a lot of the stories from our communities will be so impactful talking about this legislation, because elders can talk about, you know, the Settlement Act and how life was before, and how it's, you know, had a negative impact on our communities. And I think, you know, shining a light on Indigenous voices and elevating those stories is such a key move in all of this for all of our allies. And I think there's a lot of ways to do that, and keeping in touch with us and taking cues from us is going to be so useful. And I do think just the momentum we've got started already with all these organizations is having a really great impact, and it's really great to see, because I think a lot of tribal leaders before me were very, very lonely in all of this, and felt, you know, literally on an island when they tried to speak up for sovereignty. So I think there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful, and we're definitely very appreciative.
So we have Representative Allison Hepler with us. I don't know if Allison, being also in the legislature, wants to weigh in on this at all, or ask questions.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Ambassador Dana and Toby McGrath and all of you for being here. I've talked with Toby a number of times on this. I've been a supporter of this plan since I was first in the legislature, and while I'm disappointed that it's been carried over to next year, I can understand the reasons for it, and look forward to supporting it whatever way I can. So thanks. I learned it's always good to get a reminder. You get bombarded with bills, as Chris, as you know, and Toby, as you know, this time of year. So thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
I wondered if I could ask, this is not necessarily a question for the ambassador or Toby, but it's a question for the people here on this call. Toby mentioned, or Ambassador mentioned, one of them mentioned earlier that at least one other Democratic County committee has passed a resolution that they drafted in support of this legislation and in support of tribal sovereignty. I actually have a copy of that resolution. Toby sent that to me a while back. And if that's something that people in Lincoln County Dems would be interested in doing, unfortunately, I can't take on the drafting of the language, but I can share the draft that, Toby, I can't remember which county committee. Do you recall at the top of your head?
Washington County, and Aroostook is considering right now as well.
And Chris, I don't know the process for putting that out there. I mean, we have 35 people on the call tonight. We have a lot more than that in our membership. So I'm not really sure how to, you know, get a feel for that. But I can forward that resolution draft language that I have from Toby, I think from Washington County, that onto you, and maybe someone else could take a crack at it if people are interested in doing that. I would certainly be in favor of that. I think just judging from a lot of the nodding heads I'm seeing here on my screen, that there are a lot of people here on this call tonight that would also be in favor of that. Not sure where to go from there, but I wanted to throw that out there.
How about if send it to members?
Okay.
And ask if people have suggestions for things that we would want to alter, to send those my way as well, and we'll try to merge into something as a draft to circulate.
And luckily we have a volunteer right here in the chat. Jamie has volunteered to help with that, so that's
All right.
great.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Jamie.
All right. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, I think we've been bending your ears for a while. It's a better part of an hour that we've been doing this, and you've been very informative and graceful. Thank you very much, helping us understand the impact of this potential legislation. And I think we're going to want to circulate as well the information on how to get in touch with the Alliance and the Wabanaki Reach organization and find out more. So we can help elevate those voices, Indigenous voices that communicate what people in Maine are unaware of about culture and realities.
Awesome. And I don't think we can talk about this enough over this next few months here. I think calling your lawmakers, reaching out to the governor, writing those letters, and making space in all your circles for these issues will have a huge impact.
Thank you very much.